Thanks for coming. I'm Cael, and I'll be talking to you about removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere today. So you've had a few lectures to give you the context for why we care about this, why we're talking about this, why we're researching this over the last few weeks. From some heavy hitters. I'm a little bit younger, so apologize for that. But we've been giving you the context scientifically and politically. And so now I want to this is a real meat and potatoes lecture. We're going to get into it. And specifically, this is just a meat lecture, but it's a climate lecture, so this is actually a beyond meat steak. It's a vegan, plant-based. So just a little bit about me. So I got my PhD in 2018, studying how carbon moves around in the ocean and the sort of large-scale ocean circulation at the MIT joint program with Woods Hole and Oceanography. And then I moved to the UK, where for 5 years I worked at the National Oceanography Center, and I sort of expanded my research there into climate and CDR, which is the acronym for carbon dioxide removal, which is what we're talking about today. And then the beginning of the year, I moved here, become an assistant professor at UChicago, and sort of have added studying paleoclimate and also sunlight reflection methods, which you'll hear about later, to the research portfolio. But a big part of what me and the people working with me are working on here at UChicago is CDR, and that's what we're here to talk about today. David Archer already gave you kind of a briefing on the carbon cycle. This is my version of that kind of doodle. So I'm not going to go into this, but this is our sort of context for what we want to do. So these are the sort of different reservoirs of carbon in the Earth system and the kind of major flows between them. So what we're basically trying to do here is figure out where we want to move carbon, or a lot of it, from the atmosphere somewhere else, and how to do that. So, we're trying to move a bunch of carbon. So David Archer said a couple weeks ago, 150 gigatons, minimum, right? From the atmosphere into plants or soils, or maybe back into the ground, or potentially into the ocean somewhere. And so that's sort of the major topics that we're interested in here. So, I kind of think about this field in this sort of matrix table form. So when we're thinking about research into different methods for carbon dioxide removal, there's a bunch of different candidates for technologies that have been proposed, some of which are already being done to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And then there's a bunch of different questions that we need to ask about these methods to know if they make sense to do and to what extent. And so, that leaves us a big array of question marks that need answering. And that's basically what we're going to be doing here in this lecture. So there are some rows I haven't included here. There's some methods that are either, really kind of small fry, really don't have much potential for large scale, or are really kind of far out, wacky stuff. So, for instance, Mars has CO2 dry ice caps on its poles because at a cold enough temperature, CO2 condenses. And there's this idea that you could cool air around Antarctica to the point that you could actually condense CO2. There's a bunch of stuff like that we're not going to be talking about. We're going to be really just focusing on the kind of primary methods here. So I just wanted to give you an overview of the sort of major approaches that we're trying to consider for how to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and what we know about them and what we need to know better. So I'd like to first walk through the questions that we're trying to ask, and I'd like to work with an example that is pretty easy to understand to begin with to show you that. So one of the main ways that we actually attempt to actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere today is by planting trees. So, the basic sort of reaction of photosynthesis, by plants growing, they pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so if you plant a tree, in principle, that tree, by growing, removes CO2 from the atmosphere. And so that's actively done, in part to remove CO2 from the atmosphere today, but it's a lens through which we can sort of examine the questions that we need to know about any carbon dioxide removal method, because it's something that's intuitive. We all know what it looks like to plant a tree. So the first thing that we need to know about any method, planting trees or otherwise, is does it work? So if I actually go and plant a tree or do something else, does it actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere? That's pretty straightforward for tree planting, but it's not so straightforward for some of the other methods that we'll get into, so I'll explain that. But one of the things we always need to know, first off, is does it work and how well? Are we capturing as much CO2 as we might think, or is it for some reason really inefficient? And are there controls on how efficient it is, where in some contexts it might be perfectly efficient, and in some contexts it might not work at all, or might be net negative, might actually in total release CO2 to the atmosphere. So that's a big thing we need to know. Second, is it safe? So, with tree planting, again, this is something we do on a large scale. We think it's pretty straightforward. It's not going to do much harm to the overall environment around it if we plant a tree. But in some of these methods, we're talking about adding materials that might have small amounts of toxic byproducts in them to the environment. That might have all kinds of pollutive effects. And there may also be drawbacks to some of these. So one example is when I plant a tree somewhere, if I'm planting it in a place where otherwise the ground was very bright, that makes the overall surface darker. So I'm actually absorbing more light, and that has the opposite effect in terms of how it affects the overall energy budget of the planet. Because if I'm removing CO2, that means I'm getting less of a greenhouse effect. But if I'm making the surface darker, then that means I'm absorbing more of the sun's energy, and so that will have a converse effect. So a lot of these methods, they either have really big questions around safety that we need to answer, or otherwise, impacts on the natural ecosystem that might be negative, or they may have other kinds of drawbacks. So that's one of the things we really need to know. The next thing that we really need to know is the scale. So, the challenge here is we need to pull, hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's what we've been charged to do, right? That's a lot of carbon, and not all of these methods maybe are up to the challenge of that. So this is an example from a paper I really like, where they examined the commitments that different countries have made to removing CO2 from the atmosphere through different methods. And a lot of these countries have relied really heavily on either reforestation or afforestation, so adding forest to surface area. And this paper analyzed how much of each country's overall surface area has that country promised to add in terms of afforestation or reforestation. And a lot of countries have promised large fractions of their overall land area already to remove CO2 from the atmosphere by planting trees or reforesting. Some countries, like Equatorial Guinea or Dominica, have promised more than their land area by a factor of 2 or 3. So clearly, this is not exactly feasible. I think Saudi Arabia has promised planting a lot of trees in a place I can't really imagine them planting, things like this, right? So there's a certain limit on scale in a lot of these cases, right? We can't plant the whole surface area of the Earth over with trees many times over. Another basic question that we're going to ask over and over is how much does it cost? So planting trees is very cheap, right? I have to pay somebody to go do it, but per unit of carbon that's removed from the atmosphere, it's very cost effective. Other methods require a ton of extra energy or have other types of requirements that make them very expensive. And so in principle, they're highly uncertain, but we have estimates of how much economic damage is done per unit of CO2 we put in the atmosphere. And that's in terms of making the climate warmer and all the impacts that has and so forth. Even if those estimates are highly uncertain and come with other kinds of caveats, if it costs more to remove a unit of CO2 from the atmosphere than the damage that CO2 is doing, then the method that we would use there doesn't really make economical sense to be doing, right? We'd rather take other approaches. So there's typically a kind of price ceiling that we think for these methods to be adopted at a large scale, they need to get below. And so some of these methods are easily under that, some of them are roughly on that order, and some of them are more. So that's going to be an important question. Another way to think about it, so David Archer said $12 trillion is necessary. That's like what the U.S.'s commitment is that's the U.S.'s debt in terms of how much money it would need to spend to pull the cumulative CO2, excess CO2 it's put in the atmosphere to get us back down to 350 parts per million, for example. That's assuming $100 a ton. If it's $500 a ton, that's more than the U.S.'s current debt by a factor of 1.5. So clearly, the cost is important, right? Another question is what other resources are needed. So tree planting might be cheap, but it takes land, and that's related to the scale question. But a lot of these different methods, they have other requirements that are in terms of resources that you can express in dollar terms, but are finite in other ways, or that have other kinds of considerations, both scientifically and sociopolitically, that we need to think about. So, like I said, you can't plant the whole land surface over multiple times, so there's a fundamental scale limit on how much we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere by tree planting. Another really important question is the durability or permanence of the CO2 removal. So a big issue with trees is that they catch fire or they just degrade through sort of natural ecosystem processes. And so even though it varies a lot, you see some trees that are 1,000 years old, and we measure past climate by looking at their tree rings. A lot of trees don't make it all that long. And so if I think about how long I store carbon away from the atmosphere by planting a tree, it's pretty short relative to some sort of geological or rock-based method where the storage is effectively permanent. It's millions of years. And so that's another basic question we need to ask, is the storage timescale for the CO2. Another tricky question, which again is sort of easy for trees but will become much more complicated for other methods, is this is another sort of acronym that we use in the field, which it's an acronym-heavy field. I apologize for this, but I'm not going to. I'll try not to subject you to too many of these, but it's useful to know them. This is the MRV, which is the measurement, reporting, and verification of the carbon storage. So, with a tree, if I plant it, I can see that it's there. It's easy to measure and verify and report that that tree has been planted and that it grew and that it's there. But it's actually harder to measure the overall carbon stored in that tree. And other methods, it can be very difficult even to know at all how well the storage method actually works. And so it may have worked really well. We may have stored the carbon in the ocean or something, but it may be very difficult to say that it's actually stored. And that presents all kinds of tricky challenges because how are we supposed to trust that some startup company is actually pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere if there's no way to measure the CO2 that they actually pulled out? So it's, for example. So this is another important question. Another tricky one that's actually really important for trees is what we call additionality. So if I do some action that has the purpose of it is to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, does me doing that action actually remove additional CO2 from the atmosphere? So maybe some of you have booked a plane flight somewhere, and after you pay for the tickets, there's a page at the end that says, would you like to pay 4 cents to make your flight carbon neutral by preserving some trees in this country, right? I hope that you've all been skeptical that it actually only costs 4 cents to offset all of the CO2. Somehow, some people seem comfortable with this, but the big issue with these kind of afforestation, reforestation projects is, how do I know if I spend some money to preserve some forest somewhere that forest would have actually been cut down if I didn't spend that money, right? It's really not straightforward. And so that's sort of a big part of why there's been a crash in the offset market prices for carbon, because it's become really clear that it's difficult to say that the money I've spent on that attempt to conserve or afforest or reforest is actually additional. Maybe I go and I plant a bunch of trees somewhere so I can be confident that I planted those trees, But if I had just left it alone, then a bunch of trees would have grown anyways, because it's a great place to grow trees. So the additionality question is tricky. So another important question on, sort of on the positive side is what the jargon for it is co-benefits, but we can think about it as, are there any upsides? So this is something that's, a lot of these methods, they actually do have big potential upsides that are on top of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. If I go plant some trees somewhere, that might allow other types of, aspects of the ecosystem to flourish. You may have shrubs and grasses growing, and you may increase the biodiversity in the region. That might have positive effects on the animals and insects and everything. And so you may have kind of, whether they're quantifiable or not, you may have additional benefits that come on top of removing the CO2 from these different methods. And that can be an important consideration for a number of reasons that we'll get into. Okay, so the last question that we want to ask here is, I guess, about the social side, the acceptability, the legality, the governance, the permitting. So, in some of these cases, again, if I want to plant a tree in my own backyard, that's fine. If I want to go buy some land and make sure that the forest there is preserved by, that's my land now, that's fine. But in a lot of these cases, in the ocean, for example, it's tricky to know how it should be governed, and it's tricky for the public to know how they should feel about it. And there's a lot of complicated sort of social aspects. It's tricky to know what legal frameworks actually apply. And so there's a lot of interesting social questions that we need to ask. I'm a scientist. I'm not going to get into this all that much, but it's important as it's a big column on this table. So this is kind of an opinionated filling out of this table. If you ask a dozen people like me, they'll probably give you different answers for what are kind of okay or unclear aspects, what are positive aspects, and what are negative aspects for the answers to these questions for any given method. And as we learn more about each of these, as we research them further, the answers may change, or we may feel more confident about them. But just to give you an example, right? When we talk about afforestation and reforestation, scale, it's really unclear how large we would actually get, because it's a big problem that there's a requirement in addition to the cost, which is that we're using up land that we would otherwise need for agriculture or many other things. And the time scale is a problem. So as we've already talked about in earlier lectures, a big chunk of the CO2 that you put in the atmosphere stays there for hundreds of thousands of years. Trees don't live for hundreds of thousands of years, and so you need to be continually replanting in principle if you're going to do this, and that's a big problem. We want to, we ideally would want methods where once we pull the CO2 out of the atmosphere, we're confident that it'll stay out of the atmosphere for a long time. So trees are great, but they come with some big downsides. And as we fill this table out, you'll see that's true of all of these. There's no silver bullet here. They all have question marks or kind of fundamental issues. So another example that people are excited about is storing carbon in soils. So there's a few different ways to do this. There's already a lot of carbon stored in soils today. A lot of you probably are aware that through modern agriculture, we are experiencing a lot of erosion, and that can remove the carbon from the soil in large ways. So a big part of the change in the climate is not just adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, but it's also things that are happening on land due to agriculture. But there are a lot of nice ways to potentially store carbon, a lot of carbon in the soil cost effectively. So one example would be cover crops. So if I'm a farmer, you might imagine, and some states in the US already do this, that I could receive a subsidy from the government for planting crops after I harvest that are just there to kind of protect the soil. Normally that doesn't happen. Normally you harvest and then you leave it and then you come back in the spring to plant. But if I were to be paid to put a bunch of crops down, that can protect the soil, and those crops are then photosynthesizing, and then if you till those crops back into the soil when it comes time to plant, then instead of that soil leaching carbon during the off season, instead you're storing carbon and you're protecting the carbon that's already there. And so that could be a potentially very cost-effective method, and it doesn't require additional land because it's what's happening on the land that the farmers are using when they're not planting. There's other methods. You can build perennial plants around your farms that stay there, and they can protect from wind-based erosion. This, again, can be cost-effective. And there's other kinds of ways, I could actually just pay a farmer to plant a particular kind of plant that's just used to store carbon, and it's not actually an agricultural crop in any particular way. One report on this topic in particular, was very bullish on how much carbon could actually be stored. Could actually be stored through these different methods, cover crops in particular, and cost effectively. So, this is an example of how many millions of tons of CO2 that particular report thought you could store in different regions through different methods in a soil-based way, and how much they would cost. So, if the magic number is $100 a ton, and that's how much that's the cost we want to get below for these to be cost effective, you could potentially be doing, according to this report, millions of tons of carbon dioxide removal per year in the US for below that cost by a factor of 2, for example. This is another way to visualize that. A lot of this is happening around where we are, and then also in the kind of southeast. That's one example. A problem for soil, though, is that if you ask any soil scientist anything ever, the first thing that they'll tell you is that soil is really complicated. So this is this is a doodle of what soil looks like. Soil is extremely heterogeneous, and you can find very different things happening microns apart in soil systems, or tens, hundreds of microns, centimeters. And so it's very difficult to go out and measure what's happening in a soil system, because if I make a bunch of different measurements, then they could get very different answers depending on where I'm looking and how much I might be finding hotspots of carbon storage versus hotspots of respiration. And so actually measuring what's happening in the soil is very complicated. And so that's kind of a big drawback for a lot of these soil methods is, in principle, we could be storing a lot of extra carbon in the soil, but it may be very difficult to know that we've done that because soil science is just really complicated, and soils are really, really messy and heterogeneous. That's at least what they always tell us. In the ocean, they think everything's simple because it's all mixed around. So that's another example. We get different positives and different minuses for this method. A third one that economists have always been really bullish about, because it has this co-benefit of giving you energy, is what's called BECCS, or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So the basic idea here is I grow some kind of plant, so switchgrass, for example, and then I burn that plant in a facility where I can then capture the carbon and store the carbon dioxide that I'm emitting by burning that plant, and store that carbon dioxide underground. And that allows me to generate energy that I can then use for other kinds of processes. So in the kind of idealized economic models that economists use to ask questions about what the optimal way for the sort of energy transition to occur is, they've always really loved this method, because unlike other carbon dioxide removal methods, I get this easily quantifiable co-benefit of something that I normally am paying money for. There are a couple big issues with BECCS, though, however. So one of them is it's really unclear, and can vary a lot from system to system, what the overall net carbon flow of this material is. So if I'm growing some carbon, or if I'm fixing some carbon by growing some plants, I have to transport them to a facility, I have to burn it, there's some inefficiency involved, I can store some of it, but then there's all kinds of transportation costs, and so it can be very messy to try to figure out how much of that carbon in the biomass is actually making it into various different aspects. And so actually some estimates of the net carbon drawdown by BECCS plants have come out with negative results. So you're actually emitting more CO2 through this process when you account for the entire life cycle than you are doing any drawdown in some cases. So it can be very unclear in this case what's better or worse. The other thing, unlike planting trees, when I plant a tree somewhere, it's supposed to stay there for a long time. But if I'm growing a crop and then I'm burning it, then I have to grow that crop again that next year, which means I need fertilizer. And so there's a bunch of additional requirements. Fertilizer, not only expensive, but we don't necessarily want to be doubling, tripling our reliance on fertilizer to deal with the climate problem. And so that gets complicated too. And also, if I'm using agricultural land to grow something that I'm then not feeding people, that limits my ability to grow agricultural crops for food. And so that's another resource requirement. So this one ends up being pretty complicated and tricky as well, because there's other factors that are not easily quantified in dollar figures, or maybe they are, but they're not necessarily always done, that they get complicated. So this is, again, a method that has promise, but is also far from perfect. And then the last sort of biological terrestrial method that I'll mention is what's called biochar. So this is a recent paper that's doing a kind of literature review. Of course, it's AI-based because it's 2025. That is trying to find all of the different papers that are studying different methods of carbon dioxide removal in the scientific literature. And what they found is that, surprisingly, the largest method in terms of the scientific research being done is this thing called biochar, which is not typically a huge thing on our radar. I think basic idea there is that there's a giant literature in China specifically on biochar that was not getting picked up by the sort of American and European bodies that kind of synthesize this research. So biochar clearly is a big thing for some people, but so what is it? So in general, char is what it sounds like. This method is based on pyrolysis, so it's kind of how you make charcoal, if you will. You take some plant and you heat it, but in the absence of oxygen, so that it doesn't combust. And that's a different kind of thermal chemical process that allows that carbon to become durably stored. And then you can either store it somewhere, or you can put it in soil. It then has kind of these co-benefits because it can add to the soil health, but it also potentially stays there for a long time. So this is something that people are excited about, but you might sound suspicious that the idea is we're going to save the planet by burning a bunch of carbon, right? This is the chemical process, but it can be tricky. Different aspects, different feedstocks might require different temperatures because of their chemical makeup, and if you do it at too high or low of a temperature, it can be done inefficiently. It can be harder to do than you might think to get this right. And pyrolysis facilities are really limited, so this is done at a small scale now because it's difficult to access the pyrolysis plants. There are just not that many of them. So this is something that, again, is not perfect, but it's on the table anyways. And it comes with the same exact land requirement or land issues that planting trees or BECS does, that we have to then use the land that we would want to use for agriculture or something else, and that requires fertilizer, etc. So again, far from perfect. So that's all we're going to talk about in terms of tree-based or otherwise terrestrial biologically based methods. And we're going to switch gears to things that happen on land that don't have to do with biology. So the big one that comes up first is DAC, which is another acronym, but it's short for direct air capture. So that's what it sounds like. It's literally the sucking the CO2 out of the atmosphere idea here. So I'm not going to talk about this one because next week, David Keith, who knows 1,000 times more about DAC in particular than I do, is going to talk about his sort of journey with Carbon Engineering, which is a DAC company that he founded. And so I'll let him fill in this table, rather than myself. But it is a big part of the equation, and so he'll give you his opinion about that next week. The next acronym that we'll jump to is ERW, which is short for Enhanced Rock Weathering. So David Archer, a couple weeks ago, talked to you about the Earth's thermostat, right? The basic idea for how the Earth has stayed habitable for billions of years, despite the sun becoming much brighter over this time and all kinds of other wacky stuff happening over the Earth's history, is that there has to be some feedback process whereby when the Earth gets warmer, something kicks in that cools it back down, and when the Earth gets colder, some change happens that warms it back up. And the paleoclimatologists since 1981 have been really big on this idea that it's what's called the silicate weathering feedback. So on Earth, you have a bunch of rocks sitting on land, and sometimes you have rain, right? And there's also CO2 in the atmosphere. And when you have rain hitting a rock in the presence of CO2, that can allow that CO2 to help dissolve a bit of that rock, okay? And then that produces alkalinity, which we talked a little bit about a couple weeks ago. We'll get into that a bit more in a bit. And that alkalinity eventually ends up in rivers and makes it to the ocean, and then allows the ocean to absorb additional CO2. And so when you warm the planet, you increase the temperature, which means that chemical reactions tend to happen faster. You also speed up the hydrological cycle, which means that you have more rain. And then you also just have more CO2 in the atmosphere. So you have three different things that can allow for more dissolution of rocks, which would speed that process up and then add CO2 to the atmosphere. So you have this kind of natural balance happening, right? Does that make sense to everybody? It's kind of a weird one. It takes you a minute to get your head around. But then vice versa, when the Earth cools, that slows down the hydrological cycle. That means you have less CO2, et cetera, and chemical reactions happen slower. And so that would slowly reduce the alkalinity in the ocean, and that would release CO2 to the atmosphere. So this is kind of the process we think has sort of stabilized the Earth's climate, or at least kept it from going completely haywire, like Venus or Mars, over the last billions of years. And the concept with enhanced rock weathering is we want to help the Earth out and speed that process up, basically. So, these chemical reactions, they're naturally slow. They take hundreds of thousands of years this feedback to kick in. But if you were to imagine taking a bunch of rock, grinding it up, and sprinkling it over some soil, then you're adding a bunch of surface area where that rain and CO2 can react with the rock faster. And so you're enhancing the process by increasing how weatherable the Earth's surface is overall, right? So people are actually already doing this. $500 million have been raised by companies to try to do this in different contexts. And so this is already something we're thinking about really seriously, is basically just speeding up the silicate weathering process by sprinkling rock on agricultural land or otherwise. It's really complicated, though. So as you could imagine, there's all kinds of chemistry that happens when you're taking rock and CO2 and soil, and it's on some agricultural land, and there's other stuff in the rock that might be complicated, and there's other stuff in the soil that might be complicated. So this is a really, really gnarly problem to try to figure out what's actually happening. And so these are 116 sort of studies. Some of them have been done in models, so they're entirely theoretical. Some of them are field trials. Some of them are lab studies that are trying to estimate the effectiveness of this process, so how fast the carbon drawdown is and how much per hectare or something you can actually draw down. And you can see a bunch of them actually find that there's no effect at all, and then the rest of them find 4 orders of magnitude variation. So yeah, there are a lot that are kind of clustered around a sort of optimistic result, but these are also based on a lot of assumptions that we really, they're charitable assumptions in many cases, because the chemical processes are not well understood and there are important things that are ignored. For example, there are already organic acids in soils that might react with some of this material, and so that means a lot of that material might not actually be making it through the rivers and into the ocean without already being, taken care of. And so if that's not in your estimate, then you're going to make an overestimate. And so the spread here is more important than the kind of median, that there's really huge uncertainty about how well this works. And you can also imagine it would be difficult to know when I add some crushed up rock to a plot of land, how much alkalinity I'm adding to the ocean way over there, right? Not really that easy to figure out. So the knowability or MRV question for enhanced rock weathering is a big question mark. So again, this has a lot of promise. But also there's other drawbacks too, I should mention. Rock has things other than just alkalinity in it. It also has toxic metals. I probably don't want to add that to my agricultural land. Even if there's in low concentrations, they can accumulate over time. It can cause all kinds of pollution problems. So, it's a complicated issue. So that's why a lot of us are turning towards the ocean. So, I don't know how well you guys can read the font here. I'm sorry, this is this is a figure from my PhD. I don't have the software to change it anymore, so the font's a little bit small. But the point is, almost all of the carbon that's sitting in the kind of surface of the Earth is stored in the ocean as dissolved inorganic carbon. So that's some combination of carbonate, bicarbonate, and aqueous CO2. So you could imagine, I could pull a good chunk of that carbon out of the atmosphere and put it in the ocean, and it would be a drop in the bucket for the overall carbon in the ocean. So that's kind of a promising idea. That the other aspect is there are already huge fluxes of CO2 between the atmosphere and the ocean every year, and so just a small change in the overall air-sea CO2 flux can cause a large change in the atmospheric CO2 over time. So that's why we're excited about the ocean. I sound a little biased. It's because I am. The land has lots of promise, I guess. So the old school idea, back before carbon dioxide removal was cool, is this idea called iron fertilization. So this is a figure. It's a complicated figure. I apologize, but it does show this nicely. This is a figure of basically what nutrient is limiting phytoplankton and their growth in different parts of the ocean. So phytoplankton are like the trees of the sea, basically. And the colors in any given location, that's the amount of nitrate in the surface ocean. And where it's green, that means there's a lot of nitrate. And then where it's blue, that means there's basically none in the surface ocean. So in most of the ocean, nitrate or nitrogen is the limiting nutrient. But there are these big chunks of the ocean where there's a lot of nitrate, and we don't actually see a lot of productivity in those regions. So that means there has to be some other nutrient that's limiting the phytoplankton growth in those places. And that nutrient for most of the ocean is iron. So these little dots, those are places where people have done experiments where you take natural plankton communities and you add little bits of nutrients to the water, and you see what nutrients allow you to stimulate growth. And all the ones that are orange are the ones where when you add iron, you get a bunch of extra growth. And the ones that are different colors are different nutrients, not worth getting into. Point being, there are big chunks of the ocean. So in particular, the Southern Ocean down here has been of interest, but there's kind of the Eastern Equatorial Pacific and the North Pacific, yada yada, where iron is the limiting nutrient, and you can add iron and you stimulate plankton growth. The reason iron is exciting from this perspective is iron is a micronutrient. So that means I need a really, really, really tiny amount of iron to photosynthesize. The rough order of magnitude is if you give a plankton community a gram of iron, it can do 1 million grams of carbon fixation. So you have this big, ratio to play with. It becomes very promising, in principle, if I could add a ton of iron to the surface ocean and get 1 million tons of carbon pulled out of the atmosphere, that would be pretty cool, right? Especially because we have a lot of iron sitting around. Iron is a very abundant element in the Earth. It's just not down here at the Southern Ocean. So, this guy, John Martin, who was one of the first people to kind of recognize that iron limitation was important in the ocean, he famously quipped that if you give him a tank of iron, he could give you the next ice age. So this has been, a big thing for a long time. Back before we really had a big focus on carbon dioxide removal in the scientific community. Sorry. Okay. Apologize. And this is basically the process that we care about. So this is kind of a doodle of the ocean ecosystem and the carbon cycle. So you have plankton living in the surface ocean, and you have light that's coming down that they need to grow. And then other than iron, you have nutrients coming from the bottom, and so you have this kind of sweet spot in the upper ocean where you have enough light and enough nutrients to grow. And then by phytoplankton photosynthesizing, they fix CO2 into organic forms, and that some fraction of that carbon then ends up forming, fecal pellets of zooplankton because they get eaten and then the zooplankton have to poop, or they kind of die. They might get lysed by a virus and then form kind of clumpy aggregate particles of detrital material. But so you have organic carbon in particle form, and those particles are heavier than water, so they sink, right? And so some fraction of the carbon that's fixed by those plankton ends up in form of different particles and sinking into the ocean interior, where it can then stay for up to thousands of years. So decadal, centennial, millennial time storage. And so this is a big process by which thousands of petagrams is what I think of, but billions of tons are stored in the ocean, in addition to what there would be if there was no life in the ocean. So this is already a natural process by which the Earth is cooler than it would otherwise be, and it's been important in terms of things like glacial, interglacial cycles, regulating the climate system. So the idea with iron fertilization is that you would basically leverage this by stimulating phytoplankton growth. But then there come the problems. So I'm just going to stay over here from now on. Yeah, so if I'm going to add iron to the Southern Ocean, then I'm stimulating plankton growth, but that means they also draw down additional nutrients, right? Because plankton need other types of nutrients. So that water, by adding iron, becomes more depleted in other nutrients. And then those nutrients would otherwise, decades later, maybe sometimes years later, end up being necessary for growth in other parts of the ocean, because you have the movement of water from the Southern Ocean, and then sort of the large-scale ocean circulation ends up meaning that those nutrients end up somewhere else where the nitrogen is limiting. And so this is called, the concept here is nutrient robbing. So if I end up pulling a bunch of nitrogen out of the Southern Ocean, when that water that's in the Southern Ocean eventually makes it somewhere else where nitrogen's limiting, I have less nitrogen there. And so then that means that I can reduce the amount of phytoplankton growth I'm getting in these other places, and that reduces fisheries yields, and so you can have large kind of negative impacts on, in particular, like tropical island countries through this iron fertilization process. The other problem is that it's really complicated to know if this would work at all. So this is a figure that I made for a paper in prep. So we took all of the sort of published estimates of the amount of growth happening in the upper ocean and the Southern Ocean, and then the amount of that carbon that's actually being moved through particles down into the ocean interior. And you can see there's absolutely no correlation here. So when I have more growth in the upper ocean and the Southern Ocean, I don't actually end up getting any extra carbon moved into the ocean interior. So there's actually no real, from this sense, there's strong observational evidence this might not work. And there are a lot of reasons this could be true. For instance, it's not just the phytoplankton that are limited by iron in the Southern Ocean, it's also the bacteria. So if I add iron, I'm not just allowing for more photosynthesis, I'm also allowing for more respiration that can pull that CO2 back out. And so it's really not clear if this process works. So there's a lot of things that are not check marks in this particular arrow. So this method is continually, researched, and it's popular because if we could do this, if it turned out that it worked, it'd be extremely cost effective, and it would require very little in terms of excess resources. But there's a lot of kind of question marks about how well it would work and what the kind of negative aspects might be. And how would we even know how well it worked? So then that makes us want to turn towards kind of abiotic ocean processes, because we want to try to harness the massive size of the amount of carbon in the ocean, but we want to try to rely on things that are not like biology, that are complicated and variable. So the oceanographic community is really heavily focused on what's called ocean alkalinity enhancement right now. This is, in spirit, a lot like enhanced rock weathering. So the idea is you would take sort of alkaline material from land, you'd put it on a ship or in some kind of coastal outflow pipe, and you would then disperse it in the ocean, and then you're doing that same speed up of the silicate weathering process, but instead of like letting the natural process happen, you're just adding it right away. And so this is the basic idea. This is what a lot of the research in oceanography, at least, is moving towards now. So when I say alkalinity, this is kind of a non-intuitive concept for a lot of people. What I basically mean is alkalinity is formally defined as the excess, the charge balance of conservative ions in seawater. So it's basically the sum of all of the sodium, which is a +1 charge, 2 of the magnesiums, which are a +2 charge, etc. And that because seawater has to have a neutral charge balance, all of the kind of net positive ions I have, they have to be balanced by the negative ions. And so those negative ions are almost exclusively the carbon. And so that basically means that the amount of alkalinity is basically equal to the amount of bicarbonate plus 2 times the carbonate. And so if I increase the alkalinity in seawater, then I increase the amount of carbon that's in forms that are other than CO2, right? Because carbon can be stored in seawater as either carbonate, bicarbonate, or CO2. So if I'm increasing this, that means I have to pull these up to balance this. And that means that I have to have less of this. And so that changes. I understand this is kind of complicated, but the basic idea, right, is I add some stuff to seawater, and that increases the alkalinity because I'm adding positive ions, right? That moves the CO2 that's already in the seawater into other carbon forms, okay? That means that my CO2 in my seawater is less than it was before. So that means that the CO2 in the seawater is depleted relative to the air that it's next to, okay? And because CO2 is always just bouncing back and forth from air to sea, that's going to mean that this deficit in CO2 in the seawater is going to induce a flux of CO2 from the air into the sea, okay? So that means I have this deficit, and then that means I get an air-sea CO2 flux. So that's the basic idea. I'm happy at the end of the talk to talk more through alkalinity with everybody. It's not, it's a concept that's hard to get through the first time. I want to flag that this particular idea was actually published first by an Exxon scientist 30 years ago. I think it's important that we acknowledge this. But the idea has been around for a long time and originally did come out of Exxon. So the reason that we're excited about ocean alkalinity enhancement is because we're pretty confident it works because it's a natural process. We understand the chemistry. The equations are not really that complicated. The safety is a big question that we're trying to get after. If I add alkaline material to seawater, does that impact the ecosystems in a harmful way? It's really not clear. There are reasons to think it wouldn't, but this is something we really want to go and measure as much as we can to try to be more confident about it. We are very confident about the scalability because we know that there's a lot of rock on Earth, and we know that the ocean's very big. So we know that in principle, there's no limit to how much of this we could do, in principle. We know that the cost is probably pretty low. There are, there are sophisticated cost estimates I'm not going to pretend to understand that suggest that we can get the costs down relatively low. And there are serious requirements. So this is something that I think is important. We'll get to it at the end, but we're talking about moving material on the order of the amount of material we've added to the atmosphere into the ocean. So for the similar order of magnitude. So if you imagine the amount of carbon that we're trying to pull out of the atmosphere, you need to roughly move a similar amount of material from the land into the sea. So that's a big challenge, not on a sort of per unit basis, but if we're actually trying to achieve the scale that's required here. And then we know the storage time scale is very long because it's a sort of natural inorganic process that happens in the ocean. And another tricky one here is the knowability. So there are reasons to think that this is something we could measure, but it is challenging because the ocean moves around, it's complicated, and the carbon chemistry is complicated. So the knowability, the measurement, reporting, verification, it's not impossible, but it is more trickier than for other methods. We also have an important upside. So you probably, most of you have heard of ocean acidification. So the nice thing is when you add alkalinity to seawater, you also reverse acidification. But it's important to remember that the reason that the ocean is acidifying in the first place is because CO2 is being added to seawater. So if we do something that reverses acidification, but then also results in more CO2 being added to seawater, there's a trade-off where the more that it's effective at removing CO2 from the atmosphere, the less it is effective at reversing ocean acidification. So this is something that we're working on in our group. And the last question that is really complicated for ocean alkalinity enhancement is the kind of social acceptance or governance aspect. If you're going to do this in the high seas, what's the legal framework that would allow you to do that? And how do people feel about it? So fishermen have complicated opinions about this. There's a lot of sort of uncertainty about the governance of it. So it is happening in coastal settings already, but if we're going to achieve the scale that we need to, it needs to happen in the open ocean, and that, again, is a complicated geopolitical problem. So the last one that I'll mention is in some ways similar to direct air capture, and in some ways is similar to ocean alkalinity enhancement, which is sort of electrochemical ocean capture. So the basic idea here is I pull in seawater and I do some kind of electrodialysis process to split the seawater into acid and base, and then I end up storing some of that carbon there are various different ways that different companies are doing this, but I end up discharging seawater back, and so it's a lot like doing ocean alkalinity enhancement, but instead of adding material to the seawater, I'm using electricity to change the chemistry. So this is an example of one company's process. This company is called Captura. So they pull water in to their system, and then they pull a fraction of that water and they split it into an acid and a base. And that acid then comes back to this sort of main body of seawater, and that adding that acid pushes some of the CO2 into a gaseous form. So they capture the CO2 that way, and then they add the base back, and then they end up basically just discharging seawater that's depleted of carbon. So they've pulled some CO2 out. They've then of the water, right? They've then added carbon-depleted water back to the ocean, and then because that water is carbon-depleted, the air and sea will equilibrate, and they'll pull some CO2 from the air into the atmosphere. And so you're basically just pulling CO2 out of water, and then that means that CO2 has to go back into the water that's discharged. So this is one example. Again, there are different sort of details of how the different companies are doing this, but this is something that several different companies are doing now. So this is already happening. And again, this has a lot of promise in a lot of ways, but the costs do tend to be very high because you need a lot of electricity to be able to do this kind of electrodialysis. So yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the hope is that you would use sort of solar power or something like this. Yeah, it depends on again, I guess I'm trying to speak in generalities about this particular method because this is one case where there are several startups that are already operating and they do things differently. There's one company called Aquatic, for example, that's started by a UCLA professor, where the way that they deal with the kind of cost issue is their product has a byproduct of hydrogen gas, which they can then sell, and then that brings the net cost back down. So there are, down below the threshold that you need to get it to for it to be considered scalable. So the methods change depending on the company, but the general idea is to use some kind of electrochemical process to remove CO2 from the seawater. So, yeah, cost is a challenge. There might be ways around it. So maybe this X is more of a question mark in some cases, but this is one of the main issues for electrochemical processes. So here's a highly opinionated table about how this might work, and some of it, might be proved to be wrong or might be patently wrong right now, but this is sort of how I view this whole problem. If we're looking for like a silver bullet, right, for some kind of Hail Mary, my take is that the sort of biological terrestrial processes, these are not going to be the silver bullet for the kind of land issues that we talked about here. Like there's just fundamental limits on the scalability of these methods. Similarly, cost is going to be a problem for these electrochemical methods, right? And then for these methods that could potentially be scalable and could potentially be cost effective, they have really big issues in terms of their kind of verifiability and their efficacy. Like it's hard to know if they work, and it's hard to know how we would know if they did work. And so, I'm not going to cross DAC off here because David will talk to you about it next week and let you decide. But for me, that's why our group is really excited about OAE as a research topic, because it's unique, at least how I see it, in terms of the combination of being comparatively low cost and being comparatively scalable. So it's not actually perfect though, right? Like all of these methods have big issues, and I think I want to close just reminding you, like, yes, some of these might work, right? But the challenge that we're talking about here is just absolutely enormous. Like, even if OAE worked perfectly and there was no issues with safety or efficiency and it was cheap, the amount of material that we'd have to add to the ocean and how we'd actually do that, and how you do that in the sort of geopolitical climate of 2025, it's not a simple problem. So I know a lot of this talk has been very technical, and I'm not trying to editorialize, but let's not get too optimistic, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So just to close, I think I want to just sort of give you the impression that there are a lot of ideas out there for how we might do this, and they all have their problems, their unknowns. There's a lot of research that we still need to do to understand how well they might work, and there's probably not some Hail Mary silver bullet. If there were, it's probably adding alkalinity to the ocean, but it's a tricky problem that we're left with here, right? So one way to look at that is that there's the best case is probably that we need a mix, and really it's the more the merrier. It's not, even if I'm bullish on ocean alkalinity enhancement compared to these other methods, I'm not trying to tell somebody not to plant a tree. Any little bit of any of these things does good. And I guess it's also always important to kind of close these types of talks with reminding you that this is an and problem, not an or problem. So we're talking about this being needed in addition to rapid emissions cuts to be able to keep under kind of internationally agreed warming targets, or to keep climate damages from hitting catastrophic levels. That's really where we're coming from. This is not something that we can do instead. So this is an and, not or. So with that, I'll close and take questions. Thanks.